Standard libraries. So let's just walk you through some of the basic standard libraries. So there's different classes that are available for things like primitives. So here we can do string manipulation and other types of things with numbers or dates. There are built-in libraries for collections. We've already seen that. Enumerated lists, generic S-objects, already saw that too. And then some system functionality. There's a class called user_info, which gives you information about the currently logged in user. So if you want to find out the currently logged in user's profile ID, you want to find out their first name, you want to find out their role, all of that information can be gotten from the user_info. System is an important one. We can get the current either date stamp or timestamp using that. We can also, remember we had our system.debug, which is our version of the system.out_print or the console.write. There's an important class called limits, and limits is associated with our governors. Limits gives you the capability to programmatically inquire about your resource utilization and also the limit or the ceiling number for that particular governor. So taking a look here, there is limits.getQueries. And what this returns is the total number of SOQL queries that you've executed up until this point of the transaction. There's also getLimitQueries, and what this would return in the current version would be 100. In other words, what's the ceiling number? So if you wanted to calculate how much you have left, then you would need to do some math. Take the ceiling number, subtract the get queries, and now what you have left over is the number of resources that you still have available. Okay? So the current context of the transaction. Handling and viewing errors. Okay, so exceptions. Apex has the classic exception handling functionality with respect to things like a try, catch, finally block. You wrap a risky operation in a try, you can catch exceptions, and then the finally always executes. All right. You can either work with built-in exceptions or you can create your own custom exceptions. All right. There is a base class called exception, which is the base class for all of our system exceptions, or for that matter, if we're going to create a custom exception. There's a number of these system ones. This is just a few of them. Probably the most important one is a DML exception, since anytime you're working with the database and you're writing data to it, a lot of stuff can go wrong. Query exception, anytime you're querying, also some things that can go wrong there. The exception class has a lot of default methods associated with it. GetCause is used for chaining exceptions, so you can create your own custom exception which wraps, for instance, a standard exception. GetMessage would return an error message to the end user associated with that operation. Here is some exception handling code. So here we're doing our risky operation in our try block, and the same behavior with respect to it will fall into the first catch block that's properly scoped, and then execute that applies. You can create a custom exception. Now here's one of those sort of weird little things about Apex, which is that we enforce a naming convention. So if you do create a class which is extending exception, it must end in the word exception. So you can create my exception, but you cannot create my problem if it extends the exception class. So we enforce that naming convention. Okay? Creating an instance of an exception, you can instantiate your own exception, you can create your own custom message, you can pass a reference to another exception. So if you catch a query exception and then you want to throw your own exception, you can essentially wrap that, and then that's how we can chain those exceptions. And you can override both by using that final example. Viewing errors in the debug logs. So Salesforce has a number of facilities available for monitoring or logging your messages or system errors that occurred during runtime. Now the first one I'll talk about is the debug logs, and the debug logs is essentially a persisted data store of your error messages. What you would do, and I'll show you this in a second, is you essentially create a log request for an individual user, and the next 20 things that they do, next 20 requests that come in from that user, we essentially capture log files for that user. Now at the end of that, we turn it off. So Salesforce does not do an always-on monitoring, but I will show you how you can achieve that by creating your own logging mechanism later on. Okay, so you would need to churn. You know, if the problem occurs, churn on the debug logs, ask the user to do it again, capture the output, and then analyze it. Depending upon which category, there are many different categories of types of logging that you want to you can capture, and the logging levels, there are many logging levels that are available. They vary depending upon the category, but the types of things that you can capture are Apex, there's validation rules, request response refers to web service callouts, database interactions, anytime you're writing to the database, and so on. So let's do a simple example, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to go out here to my setup menu, and let's say I go in, and the place where you can find your debug logs is here under monitoring, and then debug logs. All right. And like I said, you need to turn on logging for a user. So you're going to click on new. In this case, I'm going to type in my name, and I could have used the lookup icon, but I'm the only Chris. So here, what I've done is I've turned on logging for myself. It says the next 20 things that I'm going to do, I'm going to be capturing those. Okay. There's also filters, so with respect to the different log levels and the different categories, that's where you can set that by clicking on the filters. All right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to jump over here, and I'm going to open up my positions tab, and I'm going to, let's do this, I'm simply going to edit a position. So I'm going to open up this position, I'm going to click on edit, I'm going to click on save. This is going to write that record to the database. I'm going to go back to my debug logs and do a refresh. And what happened was twice I requested a Visualforce page, and so that was a monitored event, which is why this /apex/filtered related list appears. But the real one that I'm interested in here is this slash and then the record ID /e. And if you think about it, that's where I was editing the record, where I clicked on the save button, which wrote that record to the database. So I can click on the view here and click on that view link and then see the output of this. Because we're looking at the output of a record being written to the database, we're seeing things like the execution of validation rules, the execution of Apex triggers, and then the execution of things like workflow rules. Okay? So jumping up to the top here, you'll see things like validation rule, date closed later than date opened. It dumps out the the actual formula associated with that, and then tells me whether or not that passed or failed. You notice down here there's the position announcement trigger. So here we're executing some Apex code, so that's being dumped out. And then over here we have our workflow rules. So after a few triggers have run, there's then the workflow rule, in this case this mark date opened, and it was not evaluated, probably because I didn't meet the entry criteria. Okay. All right, that brings us to the next tool which is available to you, which is the Developer Console. Okay? So the Developer Console can be accessed a couple of different ways. You can go up here to your Setup menu, right under the Setup menu, and select your name and then Developer Console. Or you could go out here and under Develop Apex Classes, these days you can launch it by clicking on this button down here. Okay? All right, so one little caveat here about the developer console is that because I'm on a projector that is, I believe, 1024 by 768, this is definitely a tool that benefits from screen real estate. So unfortunately, as I show this to you, understand it's going to look very cramped, but that's because of the projector, okay? So this is the developer console. It is a very functional tool in the sense that it gives you the ability to do logging. So for instance, one of the things that I can do is I could uncheck this box here, which says show my current logs only, which is essentially saying only show the things that have happened since I have opened the developer console. By unchecking it, what you'll see is that here are the logs, the previous logs that I had captured when I went into monitoring debug logs. So I can view the previous log that I was looking at in the developer console by double-clicking on it. And if I wanted to, I could open up that log, which is represented by this tab here. So the actual log content is displayed right here. I could either choose to look at a log that was captured based on the fact that it's persisted within the debug logs area, or something that I was doing elsewhere within the tool. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to limit this to show my current logs only, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to execute an anonymous block. So within the context of a developer console session, I can go in here to this execute button, and what I can do is I can open up this window to do an anonymous block. So what this does is this code, it's going to create a couple of candidate records and then insert them into the database. And what I did was I clicked on the execute button up here, which had the effect of doing the execute there. Notice that it has, so it's a more functional editor in the sense that it has the code highlighting and all that. And here is the log for that particular execution. Now, before I get into this log down here, I want to point out that you could have set the log levels by going over here to this workspace default and then churned up, for instance, different log levels for different things. And this is important because one of the things I'm going to show you later on is doing a heap dump, and in that case you need to turn on Apex and profiling to the finest log levels to capture those. All right, so within this log, what you can do is you can, on the left-hand side, let me try and drag this over, you have this execution tree. And the execution tree represents all the different events that occurred when I saved that record. So because I inserted 2 records into the database, you'll see within here it executed an Apex trigger. Actually, it executed 2 Apex triggers, 2 validation rules, and then a 3rd Apex trigger down here. Okay? So the execution tree, and like I said, I'm very limited in terms of the amount of real estate I have, shows you all the different pieces that were being executed. Now, one of the cool things here is that in this case, here I have a trigger, which is this candidate key trigger. And what I can do is I can click on that trigger within the execution tree, and what it does is it highlights over in my execution log where the beginning of that trigger was, and I can focus on it. In fact, what I can do is I can also click on this frame, in which case it filters out everything within the log view except for that particular trigger. Okay, so you can cycle through and say, I want to view, this validation rule, and I only want to see that. I only want to see a workflow rule or some other trigger. Okay. You can also filter. There's an executable button which will only show you what happened that was executable. So things like, just variable scope and stuff like that are not going to be shown. But one thing that I find this to be a very useful function of the developer console, is that you want to be able to filter out everything but your debug statements. The way you can do that is you can check this box called filter, and then you can type in user. Now, what that effectively does is it goes through all of your different log entries, and it only returns the one that contains the string user. By the way, it's case sensitive, so you have to make sure that you type it in uppercase. So if you need to do that, and it's a classic thing that people want to do, use the developer console to then filter out everything but your debug. Okay. For that matter, you could be searching through all types of stuff if you wanted to. Now, one thing that is available to me is these concepts of perspectives. So actually, let me explain workspaces and perspectives. What a workspace is a workspace is a selection of tabs that you might want to work on. So let's say that later on, one of the things I'll do is I'm going to go to the repository tab, and I'm going to show you how you can open up different classes and triggers in the editor and be able to edit edit the Apex within those. I can go into this workspace manager, and here I have this workspace that I saved off called candidate stuff. And what it does is it remembers when I saved it that I was working on the candidate key trigger and the candidate key, and I'll show you the code repository in a second. But the workspaces give you the ability to remember which tabs that you had open. Okay? So it's not just a logging facility, it's also an IDE. All right? All right, so I'm going to go back to the default one that I had open. And let me go back here and reopen up those execution logs. Now there's also perspectives, and what perspectives are is you can identify that you want to look at a subset of these different panels that we're working with. So in my case, one of the things that I might want to do is in the perspective, I might want to only open the stack tree and the execution log. And so what this does is it closes down all those other views. So much like a perspective or sort of like a perspective in Eclipse, I can now control which of these areas that I want to display. If you want to make a change to it, you just go down here to the view panels and then indicate what you want to show. And then if you'd like to make those changes permanent, just click on Save Perspective. Or if you want to create a new one, Save Perspective As. Okay? All right, I'm going to go back to the previous perspective for the sake of doing this demo. So here I'm going to click on a specific trigger. But what this does, you'll notice over here in the source area, it also brings up the source code for that particular trigger. And so I can see that, and once again, if I had more real estate, I could click on, I want to go to line 6, I want to jump to that line, and then it takes me to that line within that trigger. So if you get that classic, you exceeded the number of SOQL queries because of the governor limit, and you need to go to that, what was that exact line, from the log, you can jump straight there. For that matter, you can also click on this open button. So in this case, here's this trigger. I can click on open, and what it does is it opens up, in this case, the candidate address validation trigger, and now I can take a look at it. Okay? All right. The other thing to show you, jumping back here, is this execution overview. And so for this transaction, what it's going to do is it's going to show you all the different things that executed and then how long it took for them to execute, how many times they were executed, and then also do some math about the average, for instance, the average time it took. Now in the Limits tab for this transaction, you can see how much of your governor resources that you've utilized. So at the end of this, we can take a look and see, how much of my DML, my SOCL, and so on. Now one of the cooler things that exists is this timeline. And so what the timeline does is the timeline shows you from kind of a profiling standpoint, as the request went through, here's how long it took to execute these different types of operations. So whether it's interacting with a database, executing a validation rule, or executing some Apex code, they're shown by these different blocks. What you can do if, for instance, you're interested in this block right here, so executing this Apex code. Now, once again, there's this contextual nature of all this with respect to the logs. I can click on this block, and it's going to then focus the transaction log to that period of time, executing that, whatever this method is or whatever it may be, executing that block of code. Okay, so it resets it. A little bit hard to see in here, but it's basically resetting it to focus on Apex, and then the timestamps for when that executed. All right. There are things, there's a few other things that exist. If we're writing code, we might have some problems, or for that matter, if our if our transaction threw an uncaught exception or something like that, we could see the problems. The progress is referring to asynchronous Apex. So one of the things that your code might do is to fire off some asynchronous Apex. You can monitor either completed jobs or in progress jobs using the Progress tab. Things like these variable assignments. If I have something that is an object for the variable assignment, it'll display the memory address. But if I have in here, if I had a primitive, then it'll actually display. Now here's our iteration variable I, but if you have primitives, it will actually display the value as opposed to objects where it'll display the memory address. Okay. So let me close down those logs and then jump over to the repository. So the repository is a list or it's a tree of your Apex classes associated with your org, your triggers, your visual force pages, visual force page components, your object definitions, and then if you created packages, those would be here too. So taking a look at something like the classes, one of the things that I can do is I can choose to filter this list by typing in a string. So here, if I only want to look at classes that contain candidate, I can type that into that lower right-hand corner in order to see that. So one of the things I might want to do is I might want to edit this class definition. So I can double-click on the candidate key, and what this is going to do is it's going to open up, in this case, this is a class. Let me increase the size of this. So now this is a an editor, and so now I can go in here. And if I wanted to, I could, update my code here. Hello, San Mateo. Okay. If I had a syntax error, just to show you a syntax error, what's going to happen here is when I click on the Save button in the upper right-hand corner, actually it did it already, expecting a semicolon found 4. Okay. So then I would correct this and then click on Save, and there we go. I updated my class. Okay. Now, one of the key capabilities of using this repository, over here you'll notice the burgundy dot. And what this gives you the ability to do is it gives you the ability to set a watch point. And in my case, mine was already set. Okay? So if I go over here to the Heap Dumps tab, one of the things that I did was when I executed my anonymous block, which inserted my 2 candidates, it captured this heap dump. So here, what it's going to do, it's basically tracking the, my list of candidates called candidates. I can double click on this to view the heap dump. And so what we have here is, in my case, I inserted 2 candidates. So here's my list called candidates. And here's the 0th element, which is candidate number 1, which has the name demo0 at demo.com. And then I can take a look at the next element within the list, which was demo1 at demo.com. So you can basically set those watch points, collect the heap dumps, and then inspect the values of those variables. All right. Let's see, the repository tests, you can execute your tests. So later on we'll be working with this, but the idea is you can create a test run, and we'll talk about, this is an upcoming topic. But if I go down here and let's see here, I'm going to do my position announcement trigger test class, highlighted as a selected test, and then click on run. What it's going to do is it's going to execute the test. Here it's running asynchronously in the background, and when I get back a result, I see that my test succeeded, my verify post and verify not post. Okay? And then finally, there's the query editor. And so in the same way that we had the schema browser, which could execute database queries, we also have the query editor here. So I can type in a query. So here's select ID name status from job application _C, where status equals open. I can now execute that query, and what I do is I get back, once again, in a tab, I get back a list of results. So here, these are all my job applications that currently have an open status. Now, the thing about this is that I can actually edit these records. So one of the things that I could do is I could go in here to, for instance, application number 49. I could double click, I could change the status equal to closed, and then click on save rows. And what's going to happen is that now that record in the database, so that one was app 49, I believe. If I go out here to app 49, it's for the DBA, its status has now been changed from open to closed. So it has the advantage over the schema browser of not only being able to run queries, but also being able to modify the data that you get back. Okay?